Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome Adeel Khan. He's a hematology-oncology physician. Today's Kevin MD article is Universities Must Tap Endowments to Sustain Biomedical Research. Adeel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here, Kevin.
All right, let's start by sharing your story, and then we'll jump right into your Kevin MD article.
Yeah, so I like to think of myself as kind of dual trained between medicine and public health, and I've really sort of loved the overlap between the two. I attended medical school at the University of Michigan, did my internal medicine residency at the Cleveland Clinic, did a hematology-oncology fellowship at Beth Israel Deaconess in the Harvard system, and along the way I did a master in public health at Harvard and another master's in epidemiology at Columbia, and I've really liked the intersection between the two, where uh, as medicine allows one to look at the patient at the individual level,
Mhm.
public health really lets you talk about things at the population level and trends. And that's kind of been my focus here.
All right, so you wrote more about the funding regarding biomedical
hmm
research. Tell us what kind of led you to write this article.
Yeah, so I'm very much still an early career physician here. I'm at UT Southwestern now as an assistant professor. And as I've been trying to get my legs on the ground, one of the things that we all do is that we apply for grants.
hmm
And I certainly have done my share, updated the NIH BioSketch in the same way that everyone does. And as things became clear where the election was turning and certain themes within the socio-political environment, it was clear that that funding, which had always been a little bit stagnant over the past few years, a few being really about a decade and a half or so, it was becoming increasingly tight, which
hmm
meant that opportunities for doing the kind of work that I wanted to do became all the more limited. And with what I do, which is more epidemiologic, I need actually less funding than those people who are doing bench work, who need a lot more funding. And then with clinical trials, that's yet another level. And all of this relies pretty heavily in one way or another on the NIH.
hmm
And as that has continued to dry up, as it's continued to be slashed and continued to be threatened, that leaves fewer and fewer opportunities for a lot of us. And so that ultimately causes the entire field to suffer. And it causes all the progress that we as a country and as an academic force have been able to push forward means that there's at some point going to be a loss of that momentum, which I think is already happening.
So, just for those who aren't keeping up with the budget cuts and the funding cuts at the NIH, just give us a primer in terms of
Yeah.
what kind of areas are being targeted.
Yeah. So, I looking at the consumer price index changes with the NIH, in general, there was a great amount of funding in kind of like the early 2000s. There's what's been called sort of the doubling period that was around, the late 1990s up to around 2003, 2004, 2005. And the CPI adjusted NIH funding was at its peak at 2003.
hmm
Since that time, there has technically been nominal increases in NIH budget growth overall, although there have been cuts in certain sectors, but overall it has been increasing technically, but has not kept up with inflation. And as it becomes increasingly threatened, then it becomes all the more of a problem. So now, in terms of like real dollars and CPI adjusted value, there is less money now than in 2003. And this being 2025, it should be far greater.
hmm
The budget stands around 50 billion. 48 to 51 is what I typically see quoted, and it sort of depends on what gets included, what doesn't, which is really a large pool of money. But even that does not underscore the fact that science is very expensive. Aside from just the work itself, administrative costs are very high. And that is one thing that the current administration has threatened, saying that we need to have much, much, much less overhead. And to some degree, I don't disagree with the fact that we should be more efficient, but a lot of what is done in science has a bureaucracy behind it. There's a lot of support that's needed from not just, paying for reagents or paying for supplies, but also for the fact that you need people who manage data, who manage in the administrative tasks that come with all of this to do it properly and ethically. And those are the ones that are threatened, which as soon as those go to the wayside, then the broader issues start to become all the more emergent too. And so fundamentally, if you don't have the administrative backing to do the work that you want to do, you're not going to get to do it. So a lot of the kind of administrative heavy work, and particularly for those who are proposing new projects in early career, who have less establishment, less likelihood to get this funding, those are the ones that are the most threatened.
So, what happens when funding is cut midstream? I sometimes see in mainstream media headlines that Experiments need to be thrown out midstream. Obviously, there are going to be layoffs. So, from a boots on the ground perspective, what happens when funding gets cut off because of a change in the political agenda, for instance?
There are some people who've definitely gotten stop work now orders, and that is really unfortunate because that means you have no further funding. So whatever you have in progress, essentially it's gone. Unless you can wrap that up right there, you are cooked. There's nothing further that you can do, and there's no further support there. And the appeals process for it is extremely limited. So universities, to some degree, have tried to patch some of that, but there's only so much that could be done because they themselves rely on federal funding. They
Mm.
rely on that as their backbone. So whatever goes to a given PI's salary or the research assistants or again reagents, whatever else, the university itself is also relying on that funding for the support for all of that. So when something is immediately cut, that is just the worst situation that can happen. We are seeing some of that. That has definitely happened, and some of those have made headlines. Unfortunately, I know of some cases happening in my own university where that's happened, and it's really been mentally and emotionally devastating to the people affected. And the downstream effect then of all these cuts, or as new projects continue to then not be funded, the overall system starts to slowly crumble. It starts to just diminish. Few people go into it, so the robustness of the entire field, in which we rely on a network, right? There's this collaboration, that happens across universities, and the opportunity to explore all of that starts to just whittle away bit by bit. And so the effects that we'll see is no, not necessarily now, not necessarily the stuff that's getting cut now, but 5, 10 years down the line, absolutely. And because everything takes years in the
Mhm.
to progress, and so any sort of squeezing of the bottleneck now means that there's less work to be done later. One thing that people always talk about is sort of the doubling rate of publications on PubMed, for instance. And there was fantastic growth through the 90s and early 2000s. And while there's still quite a few publications coming out, and in terms of the rate, it continues to fortunately rise. That actually the rate of growth itself has started to slow. And part of this is the COVID era, but all of this kind of meshes together. So there is already some of these effects being seen.
So, who makes the determination of what gets cut? Are these funding cuts across the board? Is there an overseer that determines which projects or which areas specifically get cut? So, just give us some insight in terms of who makes that decision and what is the criteria in that goes into that decision.
Unfortunately or unfortunately, at the highest level, it really is very political. So it's set by HHS. Classically, the NIH director and the NCI directors had a lot of control, but that has sort of been threatened by even higher ups, all the way up to the administration itself. At the level of where a grant is submitted, though, that still is very much done by reviewers, who are people in the field. And whether or not they share the concerns with their immediate higher ups is not technically relevant because if there's less of a pool of money for them to distribute, there's simply less for them to do with that.
Mhm.
And so they automatically necessarily become then that much more selective. So they will preferentially go to more experienced investigators, those with a track record. And these are the people who are already kind of benefiting from the halo effect. So those who are early career or who have more of an exploratory project, which, sometimes leads to fantastic things, those things just will not get funded. So it's very much a hierarchy where anything at the top that starts to have changes, it ripples down rapidly. And then on the ground, it's very much seen when you don't get the money that you were otherwise expecting.
So, with universities and academic medical centers being so reliant on government funding, you propose tapping into endowments. So, talk more about your article
Yeah.
and that proposal.
So, as this has been coming up, and this is not a new idea, this has been proposed before. The purpose of endowments for universities is really to make sure that you have a pool of money. It sort of stabilizes the university as a whole. And because of the way that it's invested, and it's often invested with private individuals who manage this money, it has grown and grown very rapidly over the decades. So if you take, for instance, Harvard's endowment, as of last week, it's roughly 51 billion. And that's roughly the NIH budget itself. Now, by no means would I expect that to ever be fully spent, but to chip into it is actually very reasonable. Even Yale's endowment then is roughly 45 billion at the time of this. Now, there is certainly a little bit of disparity than that these kind of elite universities have far more funding than those that are not within that same tier. But there is money there, and that is actually not used day to day. The operating budget that universities use versus what is their endowment is really considered completely separate. Their operating
Hmm.
budget is something that they tightly bracket. That's where tuition costs get changed, where on the ground decisions are very much altered, everything from salaries to what sort of resources they offer. And that then does not even touch the endowment pool, which is very much just invested and kind of just left there. It's literally just a kind of a gold vault in a sense. And I understand and respect the hesitancy to spend endowments because wasteful spending would be detrimental in all kinds of ways. But I think the scenario now that we're seeing is if the momentum of the scientific progress that had been achieved over decades is starting to be lost, and particularly in the biomedical sciences, where again a lot of money is needed and there's so much fantastic work already being done to just maintain that, it is extremely reasonable to start to use endowment money.
Hmm.
It's very reasonable to be a bridge until circumstances in the federal government change at some point later. And I fully recognize that like Columbia's had quite a bit of its funding threatened federally. Penn has had some similar issues. Harvard has been undergoing this large lawsuit, which I'm sure will pan out over, frankly, years with the current administration. But again, that money is there and it is available and it is up to their boards to use as they deem fit. And so if there's a change in mindset, that would allow young investigators and the current projects being done to at least continue. And I don't think it would be a meaningful hit to the endowment overall. So this is where I argue that it just has to happen. Otherwise, the progress that has been made would be lost, and it's very hard to regain that momentum. Like, how do you then sort of revamp the system when so many people have either fled science or there's just not the enthusiasm for it that there once was?
My understanding of endowments is that is not just sitting in a bank, and there are a lot of these donations. They have a lot of conditions attached to them. They could only be used for a specific purpose, and it isn't just like withdrawing 50 billion from a bank. I think that it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
True.
So what's your understanding with that?
Yeah, I mean, and then there's things like legacy donations, absolutely, right? And the way that grants are often given, particularly these gift grants, they're very conditional. And I fully acknowledge that, and especially with different universities, there are rules of how they are used and for what purposes, certainly has regulation to it. But there is some degree of it that is discretionary, and ultimately it can be adjusted.
Hmm.
And so in the current scenario, that's where I think it needs to be done. I recall a few years ago during COVID, when it was 2020 itself, when Harvard had largely shut down. This was, spring of 2020. They were releasing essential workers. And the argument was made there that, for such a wealthy university, it seems like a shame to not support these people who are otherwise vital to the functioning of the university. And it would be a very small chip into the available pool of money, endowment related, to just support them. And this was made as an article at the Harvard Crimson. And ultimately, there were arrangements that were made, but only after controversy was raised.
Hmm.
And my point in the article, and again, I'm not the first to say it, is really I think we need a little bit of a push to use that funding appropriately.
So tell us about some of the obstacles that you face or others have faced when this request or this push has been made.
In general, there's not really a good mechanism actually for it. So, when let's say a young investigator is looking for a grant, we really are looking at large societies. So we're looking at NIH, we're looking at either private entities. In Texas, there's something for cancer called CPRIT. I'm looking at that. The way to petition your actual university or academic hospital, whatever it might be, for its money it usually kind of comes from your boss as part of the startup package. And beyond that, there really is not a great mechanism for it, which is kind of interesting. And I'm sure at some level, unbeknownst to me, there are more details to that of how that can be done. But because there's not an established path, it's just not simply, it really is not an option. What is in the operating budget versus what is in the pool that might be otherwise in some way available at the board level, there's a huge chasm between that. So without a reliable way to even request in some alternate way, like, hey, can I get some alternative dollars for this? It simply doesn't happen.
So who would make that decision to tap into the endowment for research? Is it the board, university president? Who actually
Yeah, the
makes
the
that final
board
call?
by and large, and some of these universities have like a kind of a corporate entity attached to it, and they're the ones who are ultimately in control of the money. They often allow investment groups to invest the dollars that they have to grow them, and that's where again there's been fantastic growth because some of these groups do extremely well with what they're able to put into the market and how, and they very actively manage it. It's not just sitting there; it's very actively bought, traded, etc. And so that's what has really led to a lot of rise in what they have. So the that being set aside, what they actually then make available out of that, again, just does not have an established mechanism, but it would be the board that of each university that can set it.
To your knowledge, has there been any comment from university leadership or a board in terms of considering to use part of that endowment for research purposes anywhere in the country?
Interesting at my own institution for some of the work that was done for some of these smaller projects, requests were made for basically higher ups for the available pools that they have to them in kind of their like their dean's pool, et cetera, to fund some of these, to bridge some of these issues that were initially brought on. But that can dry up very quickly. That's really discretionary funding, and most investigators have some, and as part of the startup package, there's usually a pool that's given, and that's what's then maintained. And as you got higher up, the discretionary funds for the offices also expand. So there have certainly been requests made. I know myself included, having made those, and I don't know how well those are tracked. So I would be curious to see what the actual data looks like on how many people are requesting how much
Mhm.
in a given circumstance. Whereas if you look at, for instance, NIH funding, that is very well tracked. You can actually see the number of projects and how that's evolved over 20 years, where the funding goes and who does what with it. But some of these more than private considerations or interinstitutional considerations, that is not well tracked. So it's hard to know exactly what is that looking like on the ground.
We're talking to Adeel Khan. He's a hematology-oncology physician. Today's Kevin MD article is Universities Must Tap Endowments to Sustain Biomedical Research. Adeel, let's end with some take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
I think for one, the NIH funding situation that we are seeing is likely not going to improve anytime soon. Even if funding does start to become more available, the stipulations that are attached to it might even become stricter. Overall, the funding has not kept up with the consumer price index, with inflation and other metrics. And so in this scenario, it's time for universities to dip into their endowments, to bridge people to continue to do the great work that they're doing so that the momentum of the scientific progress that has been made over the decades is not lost.
Adeel, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure being here.